Chairman, we're now live.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Corporate Finance and Property Select Committee meeting. A warm welcome to those attending and to our viewers watching live on the Council's YouTube channel, which is Hillingdon, London. My name is Councillor Mills, and I'm Chairman of tonight's meeting. Details of the business to be considered today are shown on the agenda, and online copies of which are accessible under the live broadcast. For those present in the room and intending to speak, please note that you'll be filmed and any statements you make will be recorded and made public. A reminder to anyone speaking today that your voice will only be audible and picked up online if the microphone is switched on. Please turn it on when you wish to speak and turn it off once you have finished. We are not expecting a fire drill, so if the alarm does go off, please follow officers to the fire exits and out of the building to the designated meeting points. Before we move on to the agenda, I'd like to introduce the councillors and officers present for tonight's meeting. Councillor Vanessa Harangi, Councillor Ray Graham, Councillor Farhad Chubadar, Councillor Tony Edgington, and Councillor Lindsay Bliss. We're also joined by a number of officers from the Council this evening, and I will run through who those are who have joined us tonight. We have Naveed Mohammed, Head of Business Performance and Insight, James Wigley, Managing Director of Key Intelligence UK, Raj Allah, Borough Solicitor, Perry Scott, Corporate Director of Infrastructure, Transport and Building Services, Sajad Rashid, ICT Project Manager, Ian Anderson, Business Manager, Complaints and Inquiries, who's not currently here at present, but will be joining us throughout later on in the evening. Michael Clark, Solution Design and Cloud Operations Manager. David Baker, IT Security Architect. And from Democratic Services, Liz Penning. Good evening and welcome to you all. So it brings us on to tonight's agenda, and agenda item 1 is apologies for absence.
Yes, Chairman, we've received apologies from Councillor Richard Lewis.
Thanks very much. Agenda item 2, any declarations of interest in matters coming before the meeting this evening? No, I see none. Thanks very much. Agenda item 3, to receive the minutes of the previous meeting dated 20th of July 2021. Can I have any comments on those? Are we happy to agree then? Councillor Edgington? If you can turn your microphone on when speaking. Thank you.
I will indeed. I'll try and remember for the rest of the meeting, but I probably won't. Yes, I was just going to raise a question. I think I saw somewhere that there was some information we were going to try and get, or Gary Pentecost was going to get, regarding the Hillingdon Trail and the styles. That's on page 4 of the agenda, and I don't know whether anything has happened on that.
Yes, so with regard to that, I did liaise with Gary, who liaised with Paul Richards about that. Apparently, he said it depends. All landowners are different, but officers will explore it to see if they can swap it for kissing gates, and they'll keep us informed.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. With that comment, happy to agree those. Thank you, they're agreed. Agenda item 4, to confirm the items marked part 1 will be considered in public and items part 2 will be considered in private. So we do have a part 2 item before us this evening, which is agenda item 11. That will be held in private and the online feed will be cut ahead of that item. Which brings us to agenda item 5, which is our review for the municipal year on performance monitoring and reporting in Hillingdon. So pleased to be joined by Naveed and James tonight. I think thank you for putting together some of the report that's been circulated to members in advance. I think you were going to talk through this, and then we'll probably come in with a few questions in terms of our first witness session around this item, if that's all right.
Thank you, Chair. So this paper follows the discussion at the last meeting where I went through a scoping report. And so this particular session was going to set out and give members an overview and understanding of the current picture, so the as-is picture, in the way Hillingdon produces, manages, handles, uses performance data corporately and within the service directorates. I won't go through the report line by line, but I just kind of draw your attention to some of the key kind of headlines. So I've mentioned this before. As an organisation, we produce, we serve 1,214 households and cover over 700 services. So the amount of information that we gather is vast. It covers the operational information that services need to carry out their day-to-day duties, but also just thinking forward and more strategically, the information that our services will need to ensure that the services that we produce or provide are fit for purpose now and into the future. And in addition to that, there is the demands that are placed upon the council by government. So there's a series of statutory returns from education to social care in children, social care in adults, through to kind of recycling that we have to produce and return on a quarterly basis, and all of that kind of generates additional work for the council. Now, the way in which we do that is that as a council, we've decided to have a corporate team. So we currently comprise 12 FTE, and we, by kind of corporately and through the directorates, support the depth and breadth of council services. Why we've done that? Because that kind of, in some respects, sets Hillingdon apart, because not all councils organise themselves in the way we've decided to. There are two reasons. Firstly, because organising ourselves corporately allows us to use our finite resources much more effectively. So we've got 12 people in the team, but they are able to serve the needs of all our services without the need of having individual performance officers in those directorates. Secondly, it also allows for better transparency and effective challenge. Because we sit corporately, because we aren't answerable to any of the directorates, some of our conversations and exchanges with those directorates are more frank and open, and it allows that relationship to be more mature in the way we discuss performance data. So I think there are certainly advantages in the way in which we are set up relative to how other councils may do that. In terms of how we develop data, that's kind of purposely kept quite straightforward. So services are ultimately responsible for their own data. They input the data into their case management systems. Where business performance becomes kind of involved is in the extraction of that data from this case management systems and making sense of it for the services. So producing some of the analytical work that goes into making sense of that data, whether it's trend analysis, benchmarking, kind of giving an overview about interrelationships between different data sets. That's where business performance comes in. But the actual inputting and management of that data from a day-to-day basis is left with the service. How much support we give, and this is another quite important point, because we're only 12 FTE, we have to make sure that our services are given adequate support. And the three kind of considerations that we make in that respect are the kind of risk associated with that service, its status, whether it's statutory or non-statutory, and the volume of activity. So just taking two examples, adult services and children's services, the risk associated with something going wrong in those services is high, especially if there's a safeguarding dimension in there. So we need to make sure that they are adequately resourced. They are statutory services, and so again, there's a need to ensure that they've got that support. And the volume of activity that goes on in those services is vast. So we produce weekly reports for them across a range of measures, and that's needed because of the nature of the work that is undertaken in those areas. And so for those areas, we've got dedicated analysts, 2+ analysts working individually in each of those areas, which means then we've got a smaller number of analysts that can work across the breadth of the other services that we cover, whether it's kind of recycling or housing or waste or whatever it is, ASBIT. And so we have to we are more discerning in terms of the amount of support that we can offer those services. In the paperwork, you'll see that we've kind of given you examples of the sorts of activity that we will produce on a weekly basis. And so on page 3 of the report, as it was, I'm not sure how it works out in the agenda, so apologies if I've referenced that, but there's a snapshot of something that we produced for our housing team, and it's the weekly applications that are received through the locator application. So this is something that we produce every week. It goes out on a Thursday. Operational managers will receive it, and it kind of gives you a detail about the number of applications that have been received, the numbers that are outstanding, the numbers that have been processed. So operationally allows them to kind of undertake management of their teams. There's also a output there that I've added in where we produce a monthly report for adult services, and that kind of gives you more trend line information about initial assessments. So again, this is about operational management for the service, but also kind of gives you an indication about kind of activity over a longer term, and allows them to kind of understand patterns and trends over time in terms of how individual teams are doing. And again, we've divided that up. There's a north team, a south team, etc. So we produce reports aligned with the way in which the service is structured, and it kind of gives you KPI information about that activity levels within those services. And then page 4, again, we've kind of produced some outputs there about more strategic sort of reports that we produce. So the first chart you'll see on page 4 is a chat report, so a children's analytical tool, that's the acronym for. And this is really much aligned towards Ofsted. So the data that we produce in here is geared towards how Ofsted, or the areas that Ofsted would be interested in were they to come into the service or the council tomorrow. So it's really about kind of ensuring that we've got an overview and an understanding of those activity levels against those key KPIs that Ofsted will be measuring when they come to do an inspection of the service. And then finally, this is something which is more of a local London arrangement. It's the LIIA, the London Innovation and Improvement Alliance report. And again, this gives us benchmarking information, allows us to compare how Hillingdon is against England, inner London, outer London, and then those individual local authorities that comprise London. And all of that information is used as part of the kind of usual benchmarking and service development work that would be carried out within the services. And page 5, table 1, will give you an overview of the sorts of other information. I won't go through it kind of individually, but it kind of gives you an appreciation of the range of information that's provided or produced across the council, and the ones that my team will be involved in, whether it's kind of producing or the analytical work that goes around supporting that. At the bottom of page 5, we'll just touch on some of the corporate reporting arrangements that we currently have in place. So not only do we produce all that volume of activity that goes on within the directorates, we bring all that together and then produce something for our chief officers and CMT for them to kind of have an overview of those key KPIs and what's going on in the individual services. And that kind of extract there you have is of the most kind of recent CMT report that we took a few months ago. And it just kind of gives, as I said, a snapshot of those areas where we're doing well, and on this particular snapshot here is those reds. So after this, in the CMT report, there was a detailed overview of the remedial actions that were taking place within the services to make sure that those reds returned amber and then green. So activity was brought back in line with where we want it to be. So we don't just produce data on a kind of operational or strategic basis. We also produce what we call kind of insight information, and this is where we've got individual projects that services may want to lead on, but they want us to kind of be involved in terms of number crunching a series of different areas to kind of give them an insight. And a good example would be work that the CCG and the council were doing around the location of children's clinics. So they asked us to kind of mash together data on the number of children with EHCPs, the number of children with SEND, the number of children that were children in need, poverty, deprivation information, and we would bring all of that together and then map it across the borough to show where those concentrations are of those kind of specific population groups. So when you locate your clinic, it has the best possible chance of success and kind of outreach for those communities that we need to be working with. And those are kind of insight information that we routinely produce for different services. And then finally, there is the kind of one-off pieces of work, member reviews that we do. So there was a good example here is a piece of work that we did for the education POC, looking at attainment levels of white British boys, and it would be my team that would have produced all that information about, what are the attainment levels, which ward or which school performs the best, or not so, and that's the sort of information that my team will be producing for those member board reports. At the bottom of page 6, we just detail the tools that we have at our disposal. So largely, corporately, we have business objects that we use to kind of extract the information, and then we use Excel to turn that information into kind of analysis and insight which we share. Outside of that, there are a series of other more bespoke systems, and they're detailed on page 7. I won't kind of go through them all. The most interesting one for us because it's more recent, is Experian. So this is information that we wouldn't normally get because it's more commercial in nature, but we've been using it to kind of chart or support our channel shift program, making sure that those residents who are more able and more willing to kind of use different channels for communication, that we know where they are, and we're able to kind of reach them most effectively. And another area of where we're doing we're using experience to profile our school cohorts, and this is kind of information that we relay back to our schools to show which kind of the schools will have deprivation information, because we provide that, the kind of indices of multiple deprivation, but this is more current, more real-time information about income levels, kind of the parental situation, about whether they're in professional lines of work or other, and this is information that schools can use to make sure that they target their cohorts more effectively. So that kind of gives you an overview of the current arrangements. I'm happy to take any questions that the panel may have.
If I can just start with a couple of questions. One of the points you made was that service areas effectively input and manage their own data. I guess, how do they decide what they pick? They just choose some metrics that they may feel are appropriate within their remit, and then they input that, and you do the analysis on it. I guess where I'm keen to understand is who in the council organisation owns the whole data piece, in terms of, if we linked it to a corporate world, who's the executive sponsor of it? Who in the council is responsible for making sure that data is produced that is relevant and accurate? Or do we not currently have that at the minute, do we not think?
So that would be, in terms of the executive responsibility, I can talk from a CMT perspective. Mike Talbot's the lead as the Director for Corporate Services. In terms of the organisation of the data, in terms of deciding what gets produced, that's a collaborative exercise, because the services will want specifications for reports dependent on the way in which they're working. So they will say, we need to count X, Y, and Z. And then we would then make sure that business performance working in conjunction with IT, because IT play a crucial role in this, because they also have a role in terms of managing the databases. We will work collaboratively to design or specify what those reports are, making sure that business objects is extracting the right data, and the definitions are agreed, that the start times, the end times, all of that information is part of an ongoing conversation that business performance, the service plus IT will have to make sure that they're designed appropriately. Okay,
and in terms of the CMT reporting, this dashboard that we have here, the balanced scorecard, is that, who determines what information is included? Is that effectively from Mike as the lead on it?
No, that would be a conversation, and Perry may choose to contribute here.
Yeah, so CMT worked with Naveed, so I met with Naveed and went through all of my service areas and worked out what was important for the service, also what are the statutory responsibilities we have to report against, but also what are the good benchmarking areas, like housing repairs. So there's lots of industry benchmarking. So I want to be able to see that we're performing in the upper quartile, so we agree a set of KPIs that Naveed will then report on and come back.
So that's effectively, you and your peers do the same exercise,
exactly,
agree what your KPIs do, which feed into this.
And we've recently gone through it and refreshed it, so yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So the extract that you see in the paperwork is just an exception. So obviously there's a swathe of other metrics that we produced and quarterly report on back to CMT.
And that CMT, sorry, what do you call it? We call it balanced scorecard. Yeah. What's the frequency? Quarterly. And then that goes to the CMT, and then, like you said, there's then actions that come out of that with remedies and future steps. Yeah. Okay. Anyone have questions, Carney? Councillor Edgington?
Thank you. Yes, very interesting. I studied statistics at university a few years ago, so it's refreshing my memory a bit about it. You mentioned that one of the advantages of having your team is that you can challenge the various departments. Could a problem be that as the departments or the various groups are inputting the information, that you may not be aware of any inconsistencies, and therefore those inconsistencies could just be extracted by you and reported on you without perhaps with there being an underlying problem in the data which has been input?
So data quality is really important for us. Obviously, we can only rely on the data that's being inputted, but that's why that initial conversation that's had between the service, our team, plus IT becomes really important, because that's where you would square those off, making sure that you have an agreed set of definitions. So often with our performance reports, there is an appendix with all the definitions in there about what exactly is being reported and what is being captured for those metrics. Now, if there's an issue where something goes awry in the service, we'll also have to produce statutory reports. And so we can't afford for those things to be inaccurate. And there's always a process of checking and signing off anything that goes off. So as we will produce the reports, it will go to the head of service and also go to the director before it's released anywhere, to make sure that there is sign-off of that process before the data leaves the organisation. But that is an important part of our work.
Thank you. Yes, I can understand, particularly with statutory reports, that's going to be a very important area, and particularly where there are going to be grant claims or something like that based on the reports which have been produced. What I'm thinking of is perhaps other areas which are less important, at least to you, and as you say, you have to concentrate on the areas of high risk rather than those of low risk. And sometimes, I guess, things can be overlooked. One thing which we will see later on, I think, in a different agenda point, is that there has been a report which is wildly inaccurate, a statistical one as well, which I'm sure you aren't involved in, but it is. It's just, I won't say rubbish, but it's misleading, let's say. And I wonder whether that could happen in some of the reports, not because of your group, but just that the information is being produced in a way which you aren't expecting.
There is always that possibility, but even under a different structural arrangement where officers are working within the service, I would probably argue that there would be more of a chance that could get done, because you've got individual officers who are asked to produce a series of reports that align with a way that or a line that people want to take. Whereas corporately, because there is that demarcation, there's that arm's length relationship, we don't have that sort of challenge. But I suppose there will always be instances where data quality goes awry. From an organisational perspective, it obviously doesn't work. It doesn't suit anybody to produce data which is inaccurate, because ultimately the services... Yeah.
Councillor Harangi.
I have a few questions. My first one, it's a lot of organisations collect a lot of data, but how good would you say as a council we are at telling the story with the data, so painting a picture of a particular social care educator? How good are we at doing that with all of the data?
I'm sure James will have a contribution there, because he's probably got that overview of other organisations and how we do it. I would say from my perspective, we are good at telling the story. Maybe the way in which we convey that story isn't always the easiest, or for services to make best use of. So it's not so much that we can't tell a story, because we gather the data, we can analyse that data, and we can produce the patterns and the trends to kind of tell that story about what's happening. How that then gets conveyed to the services is maybe our weak point, where it's not always. So it would require a lot of work for us to then turn that into a narrative style report, and sometimes the way in which we could present data could be easier.
I think just on that, just before you come back with a further question, it might be interesting just to bring James in. James, I think what would be useful is if you're able to sort of just set the scene a little bit around your background and what you've been brought in to do, like what the ask of you is, and if possible, obviously conscious that you with officers, but if you can give sort of the honest appraisal in terms of when you joined, what you were brought into, and what your early view is in terms of how the council are doing and where we are on a journey and how further we've got to go, really.
Sure, yeah, happy to. I'm MD of Key Intelligence. We've been working in the field of local government data for 15 years, probably more now. And we specialise almost exclusively in social care and housing data, so I am limited to those two briefs. But having said that, I say almost exclusively. We do occasionally get involved in other parts, but always within local authority. Currently, I think we're working with about 10 different local authorities. We usually work with about between 15 and 20 in any given year. Worked with about 50 over the last 15 years, and primarily we are called in really as an additional resource to performance teams when they get to a point where the toolkit that they're working with for taking the data out of the CMS and presenting it back as a story is limiting them in some sort of way.
Just for everyone, CMS is...
Sorry, their client management system. Whichever that may be for their housing and social care data. So the providers of those systems generally supply what's called a data warehouse, which is a translation of the heavily technical data into a slightly more digestible format, but not massively digestible. Then it goes through, as Naveed was describing, the tool Business Objects is widely provided as a way of allowing performance teams to visually interrogate the database, drag and drop fields with familiar looking names into data set reports. Those data set reports then can be refreshed on a regular basis, updated with the latest picture of the situation, and then that data then needs to be presented in some sort of way through Excel charts or narrative reports or tables. What tends to happen is that there's a bit of a limitation to the way the warehouses are designed generally by the vendors. They do a good job of getting all of the data out, but not necessarily as much of the finessing of the data, of linking up. Let's take an example of a review sequence. It's quite easy for it to tell you when the latest review was. If you ask it when the latest but one was within the last 6 months, it starts getting a little bit fiddly to produce that data using the tools. So we get called in often to provide a bit more sort of technical help using database skills to enhance the solution, really, so that there's some sort of a layer between the warehouse and then the output tools, and there's all sorts of different ways of doing that. So that's the background of what we do, and we also get involved in a lot of data migrations as well. So when people go from Care First to Liquid Logic, then often we're involved in preparing the data and moving across. So we've got a lot of insight into the way the business processes work in social care and housing, and also the way all of the databases work. And then we get involved a lot at sort of stat return time as well, or Ofsted inspection time, to just support, really provide additional technical support. Within Hillingdon itself, it was a slightly different ask. I think it was a sort of a short-term capacity issue around some reports because there was a change of there's a modernisation program going on. Stronger Families implementation. So there was a lot of changes happening to the Liquid Logic database system, requiring some pretty sort of urgent development of new reports. There was also a requirement to sort of do an overall review of social care reporting and get a sort of a broader picture from all of the teams and departments and services within adults and children's social care about what their sort of really medium to long-term reporting requirements were likely to be, and then also to try and out of that gather some shorter-term specifications for the next set of data requirements. So that's what we came in to do, and that piece of work sort of has finished. I'd say what I learnt about Hillingdon in that time is that you've got, in terms of performance, is that you've got, when comparing to other London boroughs, obviously comparing to counties, they're on a different scale in terms of resource and so on, but in terms of London boroughs and metropolitan boroughs, I think you've got a similarly sized performance team, certainly within the social care and team that I saw for adults and children, very strong in their sort of knowledge of the database, knowledge of the business processes. I would say, though, that quite a few other boroughs have a bit more kind of, one way or another, sort of technical support in terms of either in-house inbuilt SQL development skills that kind of speed up the process of getting the data and make it the same every time, so that it gives them a bit more time to work on the presentation and distribution. That's really the difference. I think Naveed's team, it takes a long time, inevitably, to give them the tools to kind of produce the data sets and reproduce them and distribute them. Whereas I think I got the feeling that the guys in your team would like to have a bit more time to analyse. Yeah. I'm sorry,
just on that, where you said that other boroughs probably have it more in teams. Is that within service areas? They have
so there's different
specific
models,
individuals and then they free up their equivalent of Naveed's time to do their actual work. Whereas here, Naveed's team are having to do some of the heavy lifting that should be done within a service area. Is that
there can be that. Yep. Sometimes there's sort of some data offices within a children's service. Possibly, usually concentrating on data quality a little bit more. But there's also there's either some sort of higher level technical skill within the performance team, sometimes doing that sort of SQL type work, where in some cases quite a bit of sort of upfront SQL investment happens to kind of transform some of the data that's coming out of the warehouses into more localized data sets that can be kind of specified once the business rules are understood, and then downloaded and repeated every time they're required. Whereas in business objects, that sort of logic has to be rebuilt every time you create a new report. So there's sometimes some technical edge that people have, either provided externally or skilled up within the team. That's usually the way. There's the opportunity here with ICT, I know, and I think there's a resource sort of challenge there as well. But it's very similar in other places.
Yeah. Okay. A couple of you indicated. Perry, I know you wanted to comment. I'll let you come in first, and then come to Councillor Harangi, please.
I was only going to pick up on the ICT point, because we've done quite a lot of work over the last couple of years about refreshing our IT and giving people a new kit and moving from Google to Microsoft. What we're currently looking at now is where the data sits in the core systems and what do we need to extract that data. And as James was saying, how do we get that data to people in a more timely manner? And what is the current data? So what does a social worker need at 8 o'clock in the morning on their iPad? And that's the bit we're really looking at technical solution now to get something in place that drives that forward.
Councillor Harangi.
My question was about, so you mentioned that it would be good to have more SQL skills, and of course that's more to do with pulling data out and so on. What are your thoughts, I guess, on the analysis part? Because if you imagine get your data and then you do the doing to it, what's your opinion in terms of the skills at Hillingdon?
So I think there's a couple of things in that. One is, and it sort of goes to Councillor Egginton's point around statistics as well, that there's certain data sets, particularly within social care, that are quite small. So to try and draw sort of meaningful statistical conclusions from some of them is sometimes a bit sort of you're chancing your arm sometimes that it proves out. So one of the things I think that again is important about the data preparation is to get things into a format that is sort of standardised first of all within the council, and then to look to partners. And I think that happens quite a bit in London, where there's sort of data sharing partnerships, where you try and mass up those statistical, obviously in anonymised ways, but sort of start to mass up those data sets so that you can actually get broader insights from a wider population. So I think it is a technical matter again, but it comes to the same thing. I think the more, I would say this, I'm a data person, but from my perspective, more work going into data preparation and having it in a standardised format and a single version of the truth helps you then in all sorts of ways with your analysis. Whether that's by as Perry was saying, you making sure that you can then, now you know your data's sound and accurate and consistent, you can then make sure team managers have got exactly the right analysis of the week ahead and the month ahead and what work and what capacity they've got in terms of workload. That would be a good example. In terms of longer term planning of services, that's where I think you need a bigger data set to really understand trends fully.
So perhaps I didn't explain myself clearly, so apologies. I think my question was more about if we had a stronger data warehouse and we had some SQL skills, so we can pull the data, we can create the right data set. Do we have the skills to then do the clever stuff of telling the story?
I could probably answer that question better than James can, because I'm more familiar with my team and their capacity. So one thing that we've focused on in business performance is making sure that we have people who really understand the service. So our adult service analysts, our children's analysts, our education analysts, they've been doing the job for a long time. So they really do know the service, they know the trends, they can spot anomalies, just taking Councillor Ellington's point earlier on. If there's a report that's produced and there's a number which looks all right, my lot were likely to get that number because they can see and they know in August last year and the year before it was X and now it's this. So what's going on here? In terms of telling that story, again, I think the service is in a really good place to do that because corporately we've got access to multiple data sets, which often you don't get. If you have a team that's split across different services, bringing all that data centrally becomes problematic. And a good example here is the stuff that we've done around COVID. So the data support that we've offered during the pandemic in the last 18 months, we've brought together data around demographics, around pupil profiles, around age distributions, all of that information, ward LSO level information, we've got that within the team. So we can use that to tell that story. I think there is, are we perfect? No, but there is more, but I think we are in a very good position to do that because we've got people who really understand the services and also understand Hillingdon as a borough, which I think again is really important. We've got vast majority of my team are residents in the borough, so they've got that kind of intimate appreciation of the borough, and will be able to tell you things around, did you know that there's a road that cuts across this? If you're going to have something here, it may start kind of, the impact on the service would be X. And a good example is we did a pharmaceutical needs assessment a few years ago, there's one due next year, and there was an issue around a lack of pharmacy provision within Heathrow villages. But what we did know about the borough was that residents in Heathrow villages are much likely to access services in West Drayton and in Botwell than they are specifically within Heathrow villages. That sort of nuanced understanding is something that my team has an appreciation of and can bring to the table.
Councillor Richardson.
Thank you. Yes, I was going to ask actually what it was. James mentioned that there were some skills which perhaps other authorities had, which you don't. Do you think, Naveed, that it would be possible to upskill your existing staff to the level in order to provide this sort of service? I mean, that's the first question. The other was a very simple one. You mentioned, I think, in here that there are over 700 services provided by the council. Are statistics produced for all of those?
So taking your first question, absolutely, I think, but it's just important to kind of bring into this equation that it's not that the council lacks those skills, it's just the fact that they are arranged differently. So our SQL support is provided through IT, and we get very good support through IT in terms of that provision. And so just because it's absent within business performance doesn't mean it's absent within the organisation. There is absolutely always an opportunity to upskill, and a good example here is that in the last sort of 6 months, our senior analysts within business performance have been taking on GIS skills, so learning Esri, which is the corporate system we use for GIS. And why? Because services often need to know how the distribution of their clients is across the borough, and if they're able to bring that to the table and bring that in their reporting, that only enhances the service that we can provide our clients. So there's definitely an opportunity there, and I know my team will be sort of certainly up for that kind of opportunity. In terms of your second question about do we provide data for all 700. Not routinely, we don't, but where we are asked to support, we absolutely do. So two good examples on that would be, at the moment, there's some transformation work going within Dan Kennedy's area around libraries, so we're supporting that. Well, it's not, libraries isn't something that we will routinely support, but on this occasion we're doing some work around libraries in terms of footfall, etc., and analysing all of that data. And similarly, we did supported waste services as well in a similar sort of way when the new recycling work was ongoing and the new kind of waste collection. So there'll be instances where we will get involved because we have the expertise around that area.
If I can just follow on from that. So where we're saying, if for example, you said 700 services, if the council says to you, or management leadership says to you, we'd like to get reports on all 700 services, is that something that we would be resourced to do, or is that like you're just going to say there's just no chance that we can do that? We don't have enough people. It's an unfair ask.
All 700 at the same time? No, that would be an unfair ask.
Yeah, just too many to be able to do with current numbers.
I don't think any team anywhere would be set up to produce the data for.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. One thing I just wanted to get some thoughts around was, say that we send reports to teams, departments on a regular basis. How many of them do you think are continually used, or are there numbers that are just done because they've always been done, and sending the report is ticking the box and people might receive the email, but it probably doesn't go much further than that? Is there much done in terms of down the line? And this may again be at the service directorate level to follow through, rather than your team who are requested to produce it, so you produce it and you always have done, to understand, are these still relevant, are they still used? Has anything done to sort of tidy that up at all?
We do. We go through exercises, maybe an annual exercise, or maybe every couple of years, just to kind of go through, because every one of those reports is often additional work that's required of the team, and therefore if we have an opportunity to scale some of that back because it's not needed anymore, it allows us to free up capacity within the service. So it's a win for us if that happens. But I would probably again say there are reports that have been automated because a manager may have asked for them a number of years ago. That manager is no longer here, but because they are automated and they're sent out every Monday morning, that report will probably still be sent out. Whether it's read anymore or used, I can't be certain.
Councillor Hanji?
Last set of questions for me. So two questions. What would help your team do a better job from a data, people, tools perspective? And if you had that, what would you focus on?
I suppose just picking up on Perry's point around the tools, I think the council is in a really good position to make that step change now, because two reasons. Firstly, the tools that other organisations use and the way in which information is shared with us offers us a really good opportunity to kind of enhance what we do. So a lot of the time we may receive something that we have to then rejig because we don't have the tools to be kind of able to just absorb that information routinely, and so that causes, as I said, additional kind of capacity challenges for us. But I think once we have those tools and once we've kind of gone through that journey, because I think Perry's absolutely right, there's no point kind of bringing something in if all the data isn't lined up correctly. But once we have that, I think the added value would be that my team would do the analytical piece. Because at the moment, my team gets involved in a lot of the production piece of that, and therefore we don't have as much time to interrogate and tell the detailed story that we would want to, because we're so involved in making sure that the data quality issues are being resolved and we're capturing the right thing, extracting the right thing, and producing the right set of numbers on an Excel spreadsheet.
Okay, I've got my very last question. What would you say is the data culture at Hillingdon? And probably not just from within your team, but when you're challenging the service areas, what would you say is that culture when it comes to data?
I think like lots of organisations, it's mixed. We've got some really good areas of very good practice. We've got service managers that are absolutely on top of their data, but we've got other areas that have still got a journey to go through. But again, every organisation will be in that same sort of position.
Councillor Edgerton?
Thank you. Yes, I'm just the quarterly report which you've given is just an example. I appreciate that. When you're benchmarking Obviously, in this case, you're comparing with the other London boroughs. But do you base it sometimes on statistical neighbours? And if so, when are statistical neighbours chosen rather than just London boroughs, for example?
So our services often like to be matched or benchmarked against statistical neighbours because that's where it's most value to them. And also when Ofsted come in, they often do it against statistical neighbours. Ultimately, it's the clients that decide for us about who they want to benchmark against. Sometimes the kind of West London context is the most appropriate. So, for instance, a lot of the COVID stuff we do, we are benchmarking against most of our near neighbours because we live within that proximity and then our population flows go across borders. But that also includes the likes of Buckinghamshire and Slough and Hertfordshire, so it's not just the London boroughs that we limit that to. In children's services, there'll be the most similar family group, which is the sort of statistical neighbours. But in other areas, they may want a London comparison, and it depends really on who is asking for the data and what they request as the benchmark.
And in that case, in the case of choosing what the benchmark is going to be, how the benchmark is going to be determined, is that something where you have some input, or it sounds as though it's the client who decides rather than you?
The one thing which, again, I think is a really positive aspect is that we've got a really good working relationship with our services. So there's kind of weekly meetings that we'll have with the service heads and with the directors. And that will involve, so if we say maybe the London context isn't the right one for this, you may want to look at these because they provide a better benchmarking. That's part of the conversation that we would have and the service that we would offer.
My last question, perhaps. We talked about the data. Is there very much which you do in terms of forecasting using that data to provide information to the various groups and departments as to future expectations of demand?
Forecasting for us is probably another area of development. We can do straight line forecasts. We can look at previous trends and say, well, we think it might go this way or that way based on previous year's information. The one area that we do forecasting, and we're very good at forecasting, is school places planning, because we bring together a range of data sets, and we have support through the GLA because there's a model that brings into the account the kind of flows of pupils across borders that we also need to take into account. So, over the years, we're usually within sort of 2.5% to 5% accuracy when it comes to our pupil forecasts. And so that's an area where we're in terms of forecasting, we're pretty good at. In other areas, it's an area of work for us.
Can I just come back to the CMT balance scorecard? And given that Perry's here, I hope you don't mind if I leverage your input on this as well. I just want to try and get a little bit of understanding in terms of background around this. So how long has it been in place? When was it last reviewed in terms of like what the key metrics are? And then to understand how is that presented. So do you get the corporate directors together who effectively gives the presentation, who leads it, who's in attendance on it? How does this high level balance scorecard work? How's it delivered?
I mean, from the recent experience, Naveed attends CMT and brings the balance scorecard to CMT. Prior to that, we would have all seen our own scorecards, and we've very recently, probably over the last 6 weeks, gone through our own areas and agreed what that scorecard needs to be, and removed any that were useless or didn't add any value. So we're really targeted on that, and I've probably got circa 25 key ones across all my services that I need to watch and make sure services are happening as they should happen.
So when you see it, it's a collective CMT meeting?
Yeah.
Okay.
So in CMT, we see everyone's services across the piece.
And how long's that gone? Is that
That's been going on for some time. I mean, I've only recently joined CMT.
As long as I've been here.
In years? Right, okay.
We've had a CMT style report. The format's changed, and so we used to have a report which was a very much a narrative style report covering a set series of areas, and it was felt that had become a bit redundant because it was the same stuff every quarter. And so now, because we bring in the KPI piece and the kind of remedial actions piece, it is a report which is a bit more dynamic, if I can use that word.
And irrespective of resource, so if talk infinite resource, is quarterly enough? Is that frequent enough? Does it change enough? Does it give you enough time to follow up on it, or is there in an ideal world, with infinite resource, would a different frequency be better?
No, I think it currently is working fine. I think as we're currently, shaping them and rechanging them, we'll relook at that, and then obviously we'll overlay whatever we end up in terms of buying technology we get and where we deliver it. So it's about officers having the right data when they need it. As long as CMT have got an oversight that things are happening, I think it's in the right place. And again, so sorry, I'm drilling down on this. When you have that quarterly meeting, what is that? An hour, half-day session? How long does that typically last?
It'll be an itemised part of the CMT agenda, so it'll most probably be a 30 to 45-minute conversation about those metrics. Just picking up on the earlier point about the frequency. So we bring the data, collate the data corporately for CMT, for chief officers to have a look at. But outside of that, on a weekly and a monthly cycle, there is those same KPIs are being produced and seen by the service managers and service heads and Perry and his CMT colleagues. So there is that ongoing oversight. It's just corporately we have the opportunity on a quarterly basis to bring it together to make sure that there's that socialisation of that data across directorates.
Well, what I'd like, if you can do, please, outside of this, if you can articulate that to Liz in terms of how that is delivered, so the frequency of how you do it outside of the meetings, and then whether the full meeting, how that fits together, just so I've got a clear view as to how that whole process works. That's right. Okay, come back in. And just as a live example, so I've recently rolled out a new food waste service collection. So for me, data on that has been key. So I can't wait quarterly. I've been asking for daily reports on missed bins so we can get to the residents. We missed you last week, we missed you again. There's a problem. We need to go and find where it is. So, we'll often ask for data like now or every day, because it's key to make sure the service is running well, rather than waiting for quarterly reports. Councillor Richardson.
Thank you. Leading on from that, and the report, the quarterly report to the CMT. What timescale after the quarter of the reports available to the CMT, and how soon after is the meeting?
We do try and make it timely, because there's very little value in taking a report in September which covers information that was in April. So it is, as soon as we try and do it within 3 weeks of quarter end.
Sorry, so just on that, so quarter end, you have the report out 3 weeks within that, or the meeting is 3 weeks? So
we will try and gather all the information within those 3 week period and schedule a meeting within 3 weeks of that. So it'll be the third CMT after quarter end, where we would have gathered the information, processed the data, and presented the report.
Okay, and sorry, CMT is weekly? Right, that makes sense. Okay, thank you. Councillor Tubadar, can you put your microphone on when speaking? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hear earlier it was mentioned that we have moved from Google to Microsoft and we do not know where our data is, and we are in the process of trying to establish where they are. Is there any time scale for when are we going to accomplish that task?
Yeah, we know where all our data is. Our data is in the core system. So you've got a social work system, it sits in there. You've got a housing repair system, it sits in there. What we're currently looking at is the tools we need to extract the data out. These data tools are quite expensive, and we need to make sure we invest in the right product. And going back to one of Councillor Mills' points, we need to make sure that the data we're pulling out is of value. So what we don't want to do is start pulling out all this data and no one reads it or looks at it. So we are in a process of starting to work with services to say, okay, where's your core data? What do you need? Who needs it? When do they need it? Because all of that comes at a high price tag, so we can make sure it right. So the data's all there. We can get to it all now, and the V's team get to it all now and use it. We're talking about enhancing that going forward. We want to make sure we're investing in the right technology that does the right thing, and we don't pay for something that doesn't get used. So we don't want to get suckered by a salesman. We want to make sure the product is what we need going forward.
And have you assessed what type of products are there to deploy?
I mean, there's a number in there, and a lot of the core systems sell their own products. The one that most people are talking about now is this thing called Power BI, which is a Microsoft product. And I think that does come with some big benefits, and I think people like the NHS use the same tool. But it's expensive, and we need to make sure that the right people have got it, and we don't want to just create data for the sake of it unless we really have good ownership, understand what you're doing with it, which which is some of the work that James has been helping us with and Naveed is focusing on. So, and we need to just do that in a controlled way so we don't run off and invest money we don't use.
Councillor Harangi.
I thought it was my last question. Maybe this one will be. Is there any cross-department or cross-directorate analysis done? So, for example, if you're collecting data from social care, they'll be interested, but perhaps another department may benefit from knowing something's going up or something's going down, and how is that done? Or maybe it's done at CMT level?
No, so that will be the insight piece that we do, because you're absolutely right, there will be information that we gather in children's services that will be relevant in another part of the service. And so a good example will be, so often in our green spaces, the provision of the Fiesta, kind of the program that we have for the summer, they will call on us to produce a series of information that we could extract from children's services. So how many eligible pupils are kind of in receipt of X, Y, and Z. Similarly, we have access to not the raw information because there's strict data protection, but our Revs and Bens produces some really good information that we use to support the provision of something in children's services. Our winter grants program, for instance, that was delivered within the kind of finance team in terms of operationally, but it was my team that produced all the free school meal information in terms of eligible families. So there is lots of those sorts of examples that we have.
Okay, thank you very much. Very helpful. Thank you for everyone for the questions and for responding to them. In terms of the review, so we've got another witness session at our next meeting where we've got a number of the service managers across different parts within the council. I think that, Liz, if we can, I'd be interested if we could get Mike Talbot to that as well, if possible, given some of the comments that we've had tonight, and so you said that if we're saying he's the lead in terms of corporate director around that, I think that'd be useful as well from an overall strategic perspective as well. But thank you very much, Naveed and James. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Councillor.
We're free to leave. Councillor Edginson, yeah.
I'm just going to. I see James is down again next time. Is that right, or is that just a mistake on that?
He is down next time, but I am following this evening. I am comfortable that I don't think we would require him again unless people feel otherwise.
And we also talked about perhaps having too many witnesses, particularly from social care, and it still seems that we've got rather a lot, but very few from resident services or finance or even legal.
I think some of these have changed, and we can take it away. I think some have changed. I don't know each of them individually to know what area they represent, but yeah, I think we were trying to get more of a cross section, even if some of them were going to say no, we don't currently produce anything, but this is what this is what we would like to do going forward, or the reasons why they could be limited.
I think we've got one from adults, one from children, and then we've got housing, waste, ASBIT, so a number of the services that are kind of
I think we've probably got more of a cross section than we initially identified. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, guys. Thank you. Okay. Agenda item 6. Raj, thank you very much for your time. Information governance, data protection in Hillingdon. Thank you for the report which presented before us tonight. Anything you wanted to talk through in particular?
Yes, first of all, a very good evening to all of you, and thank you for inviting me to the meeting of this select committee. The report that I've prepared is literally just 3 pages of A4, and it doesn't even begin to capture the very, very vast subject that is personal data. So continuing with the theme of data, the GDPR, which came into force just over 3 years ago, swept away the old data protection regime and introduced a whole set of new laws and procedures. It was just a fundamental overhaul of the data protection system within Europe. And then the Data Protection Act 2018 incorporated the GDPR into English domestic law. So you have to read the 2 statutes together. The GDPR and the Data Protection Act 2018 now provide a composite set of rules for safeguarding personal data within the UK. And what we have is we have a regulatory body in the form of the Information Commissioner's Office who oversees not just data protection but also freedom of information. And what I would say, rewinding back to January 2018, I was appointed as the Data Protection Officer for the Council, and then I convened a small working group, and together we worked for 3 or 4 months to prepare the Council for the new data protection regime. And we devised a dozen or so policies, and we also provided extensive training across the whole Council. So there were a ballpark of around 40 training sessions for officers, and I also remember providing training for all members of the Council, indeed in this very room, and that training was provided over 7 or 8 different sessions. And it was very important that councillors were trained properly as well as council officers, because councillors are obviously data controllers in their own right. You have your own ICO registration number, and you are responsible, if you like, for your own data protection, although you still obviously work within the remits and the parameters of the council. So we brought those policies into place. We did all the training, and I think it's fair to say that policies on their own didn't actually provide much assistance, because they were just a set of written procedures, and without actually understanding what they meant and how they were to be implemented in practice, they weren't really worth the paper that they were written on. So what we did was we not only provided oral training to members and also to council officers, but we also provided an online GDPR training module, and that has been rolled out on an annual basis. Each officer of the council is required to complete that training, apart from myself, and they'll get a certificate to show that they have successfully completed that particular training. So we have these new procedures. There has been a very significant overhaul of data protection. Consent now, if you require consent from individuals to process their personal data, that needs to be provided in writing. They have the right to withdraw their consent. There are lots of different bases for lawful processing of data. People now have the right to request the erasure of their personal data. They have the right to rectify their data as well. So there is a whole set of new rules. And one of the significant changes made by GDPR was in relation to subject access rights, otherwise known as SARs. So individuals have the right to write to the council and ask for information which is held by the council about them to be disclosed to them. And under the old regime, they had to pay a £10 fee, and that was then swept away. So we do get, I call them SARs, subject access requests. We get a lot of them. And this is an area where the Information Commissioner's Office has really drilled down. They did an audit of all London boroughs, and they found that the majority of them were not complying with a 1-month period within which they needed to respond to SARs, and that included Hillingdon. So at a senior managers conference in October 2019, just before the pandemic, I had a slot and I talked to senior managers and really played a very large emphasis on the fact that their officers needed to comply with these SARs. Otherwise, the Information Commissioner's Office would come back and start knocking on our door, and he would have the ability, she would have the ability to take enforcement action against the council. And I'm pleased to say that our performance in relation to SARs has, markedly improved, and we are now around the 90% mark in terms of responding within time, and that is an acceptable percentage level for the ICO. One of the biggest concerns that I have as Data Protection Officer is data breaches, and with the best will in the world, again, you can have all the policies and procedures that you like, but you can't legislate for human error, and in an organisation of this size, there is always a scope for human error to occur. The most common examples are that people, when they email others, they use the wrong email address, or they copy people into an email which they shouldn't have. Those are sort of common breaches. But we have had, a couple of more significant breaches. And what we have an online data breach reporting form. So as soon as a breach has occurred within the council, no matter how minor, the officer in question has to complete that form and then email it to myself, so I'm aware that a breach has occurred, and then I have to make an assessment about whether or not to report that breach. If the breach compromises the rights and freedoms of individuals, then I'm required to report that to the ICO within 72 hours. And if I fail to do that as a council DPO, then the council can be significantly fined for failure. So that's one thing that I always observe. In terms of resources, we don't have a lot of resources to throw at this. There's myself, I'm the DPO, I oversee data protection, I do all the strategic work, and when there is a breach, I'll report it to the ICO. I have an information governance lawyer who does the day-to-day work in terms of responding to SARS, dealing with FOIs, and also advising council officers on a day-to-day basis in relation to data protection matters. And then my deputy, Glenn Egan, he also steps in and assists me, and he does a lot of work on FOIs, and he also has provided training on both FOIs and SARS. So I would say that, you know, by and large, in an organisation of this size, GDPR has now been enforced for over 3 years, and I think we have largely kept the show on the road. We've had COVID, obviously, in between, where a number of council officers were having to work from home almost on a full-time basis during the worst periods of the pandemic, and that meant that officers had to take more personal responsibility. They didn't have their managers standing over their heads, you know, making sure that they were complying with GDPR. It was a case of taking personal responsibility. And as DPO, I would have to say that I am fairly satisfied about the data protection regime within the council. Yes, it could be better, anything could be better, but we have avoided, touch wood, any enforcement action being taken against us by the ICO. And in the 3 years that GDPR has been enforced, I have not been alerted by any members of the council that they've had any particular issues in relation to data protection either, because I did make it clear at my training that although you were data controllers in your own right, if you needed any help and assistance with data protection, you could always come to me or my team. So just to conclude, the training is now 3 years old. I will undertake to provide a fresh round of training after the local May elections next year to all members of the council, refresher training, and any members who want to complete the GDPR e-learning module are very welcome to do so, and that can be made available if you wish to do that. So I think I will stop there. I think I've probably said enough by way of introduction, but I'm happy to answer any questions that members may have.
Thank you, Councillor Edgerton, and then Councillor Tubadar.
Thank you, Raj. It's a nice, concise. It's quite difficult to do quite as concise as this report on such a wide area. I assume, I've got two questions. One is relatively simple, and that concerns the elected members who have come through as by-elections. I assume that they have been given some training on GDPR since they were elected.
I believe that the packs that I prepared for members have been sent to them. No face-to-face training has been given. Yeah.
And the other point was, I checked to see whether my individual registration with the Information Commissioner's office was there, and it isn't. And I checked for everybody else, and I believe, according to the correspondence I've had with the ICO, is that they were all cancelled in 2019, so that we're all no longer got our individual registration.
Okay. Well, that is news to me.
Well, I assumed it was because you didn't put it in the...
Well, I wasn't aware of that. No one's alerted me to that, but now that you've mentioned it, I will look into that, and I'll get that.
So I think the point will therefore be that we will be operating under the council's registration.
Yes.
So maybe that needs to be taken into account in some way. I don't know how, whether we should be also having annual training.
I think that's probably an oversight. It can easily be rectified. So I've made a note of that. I will look into that for you. Yeah.
Well, I would say that I'm already registered as an accountant anyway, so it covers. I've been told it covers my council work as well. So
yes.
That's all right.
Thank you. Councillor Tubadar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to basically say congratulations to yourself, your team, and everybody involved in Hillingdon, because it looks like that we haven't had any data breaches apart from the minor one, which we weren't given any punitive action in Hillingdon, and it really deserves a thank you very much, everybody who is involved, including IT. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. No further questions? No? Right, thanks very much for presenting that to us. We will note that as an item. Thank you. You are free to go. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Agenda item 7, Hillingdon Digital Connectivity Strategy. Sajad, I'm glad to welcome you this evening. Thank you. I know this went to Cabinet last Thursday. We went through there. So, yeah, grateful if you can just talk us through the report, please.
Hi, thank you for inviting me this evening. I'm the project manager for the digital connectivity strategy. I won't go through the report itself that went to Cabinet. I'll just give you a brief of the strategy, and then I'll tell you about the progress that we've made so far. So the strategy mainly consists of 3 strands, which is a digital place, which is to uplift the infrastructure of the borough, which is currently in not so good shape, because according to Connect London, we're about 5% of full fibre, according to the other West London boroughs, which are around 20% between that. So we're at the lowest point across the whole of West London. And that's the first part of our strand, which is digital place. Then digital council is where we want to be investor ready, where to encourage investment into the borough by inviting, fibre optic businesses, telcos, to come in and to invest. So we need to be investor ready to not put any stumbling blocks for them not to invest into us. And then the third strand is our digital inclusion. The digital inclusion strand is where we need to, when we had the pandemic, we had a lot of individuals who weren't able to access computers, internet. So that is one of our strategies that we need to put in place, so then people who are disadvantaged can use internet. So in order to achieve this, we set up a team. This goes back in November 2020, where Genesis came and they did a consultancy for us, and then in February we set up a team which consists of myself, Perry's the lead of the team, and then we have Kelly Wolke as well. And we normally have every 6 weeks we have a steering group, so we can be transparent with all the services within the borough. So it's an open forum for them to give us their ideas, and we're transparent to them, to what we share and what we're doing and what our strategy is, and they can put inputs into what they're planning on doing. Because generally what we're trying to achieve is a single channel of digital inclusion for the whole borough. So then everything that is digital should kind of be governance. So then we have a single goal, single vision. And current progresses we've made, we've had way leave agreement signed with Openreach, and Openreach have openly said to us they're going to probably invest in the region of 7 million in our exchanges. That includes 7 exchanges in the borough. 2 have already been uplifted to fibre optic. We have 5 which are going to be announced soon, which they've told us in August that they're going to announce them. And currently Openreach are doing surveys for us to uplift our social housing in multiple dwelling units. And that's for full fibre. And we have also, we've signed wayleave agreements with Community Fibre. Community Fibre are also a fibre optic company who will be uplifting our infrastructure to fibre optic, and they will be targeting our social housing. In addition to our social housing, they will be giving us 10 free connections for our community centres or community spaces. And that's with the fibre optics. And then for 4G and 5G, for 4G we have Telefonica, who approached us to say they had some network congestion issues within our town centres, and they wish to uplift with providing us 4G small cells. These 4G small cells would alleviate the traffic congestions that they're currently facing. So currently they've done their surveys and they're waiting on approval to go ahead with that project. And lastly, 5G. 5G, as you know, is kind of elementary at this stage, so there aren't many operators who are trying to come into the borough. However, the ones that are coming into the borough, they are putting planning applications, and lucky enough, the planning team have given us the opportunity to be part of their consulting, so we can consult on whether these are viable or not. And yeah, is there any questions?
If I can just ask first of all, before coming to other members, talk about some of the examples where they're going to further investment into exchange, installing small cells technology. What physically is that? What does that mean? Is that they're going to build something? Is there going to be more phone mast boxes in town centres? How is that delivered? What's the infrastructure that happens there?
Okay, the first question was the infrastructure of the fibre optic, right? Fibre optic is under the ground, so generally speaking, they would not be putting any boxes in. It will just be from the exchanges, and they'll be going either underground, and sometimes they're going up the telegraph poles as well, and putting like small boxes on telegraph poles. The only distinction is with the fibre optic, with the current technology, is they'll have a few, more boxes on the actual physical buildings themselves. So everything else will be under the ground. Whereas 4G small cells and 5G small cells there would be additional boxes, probably, depending on different operators, but there would be additional cabinets on streets, and also there'll be physical boxes placed on however many columns they need to use. Okay, so I'm sure now when I go out and about, I'll see lots of them, having never probably noticed them before. So, are these like the green boxes that you often see, like the engineers plugging things in and out of? Is that where these? Yes, they are the green boxes. Okay. And also, if you're going down to appearance, if you've seen a 5G masks are them tall 20-metre like darts in the ground. Okay, so in terms of street scene visuals, there is an impact potentially from this. Potentially, yeah.
Yeah, I think it should be minimal. I mean, the BT we're working with quite closely, so they're basically ripping out all that copper from under the ground and putting these really fine, like hair fibres through. So generally, that's not going to have a huge impact. I think the bigger impact will be when the 5G turns up, which the providers aren't really pushing too hard yet because they're still building it. That's when the bigger impact will be with the masts. But the BT work is quite beneficial because it's mainly under the ground, and we don't see it. And the benefit of that is once the fibre's in place, as a resident or a business, you can then use any provider, because if you want to use Virgin or Sky, they all rent that same line. So actually, it's good infrastructure once it's there. And obviously, you commented in the report says that we're probably behind some of our neighbours in terms of this. In terms of what we're doing here, is this investment / infrastructure going to bring us to parity, or is it future-proofing that what this investment is going to do is going to make us good for 5-10 years without having to redo it, or is that an unknown? And then, secondly, what's the time frame of delivery for what we've described and talked about here? With aspect of future-proofing, it is future-proofing because fibre optic is used for 5G small cells.
also that technology, if you don't have fibre optic, you cannot have 5G small cells because it uses the fibre optic to use the small cells. And in comparison to our boroughs, would it put us on par or above? Because we're part of the WLA, which is a West London Alliance partnership, which we attend meetings with them. And out of all the boroughs, I don't think any of the boroughs have signed any agreements with Openreach. And the difference between Openreach and, say, community fibre or hyper optic is Openreach is open access, where Perry said you could have Sky, Vodafone, whomever can rent their line, whereas community fibre are just a single provider who only provide themselves. So it is just like one provider. So in that aspect, Openreach have already started surveying, and timescales they've given us, they've said by the end of the year they should have surveyed all our properties, providing they have access and there's no resistance, and they'll start build early next year on the units.
And from starting, how long do we expect that will then take them? When will we be in this good position, the end state that we're aiming for?
They're currently working on the Uxbridge and Hayes one, and they've gone quite quickly. So I think they've delivered the majority of that in about 8 months. But we can push them and confirm a time, but rather not.
It's just to get a ballpark really, but it's on a phase basis.
Yeah, once they do the surveys, I mean, and they're out now surveys in now housing stock. So again, as soon as they can get in.
Yeah, so it's a rolling programme really. Okay.
Yeah, and we'll monitor on it and report back today.
Thanks. Councillor Tubadar and then Councillor Bliss, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You asked some of the questions I was going to ask, and Sajjad managed to answer some of the others. However, which is really good, because we wouldn't spend too much time repeating certain things. There is one thing which I see here, is that we mentioned Openreach is going to be laying the fibre. Are they the only provider which is going to lay the fibre in our borough?
No. See, we've signed agreements with Community Fibre.
Are they laying their own fibres?
They will be laying their own fibres. And also we're in the process of signing Wayleave agreement with Hyper Optic as well.
Does that mean Community Fibre will run end-to-end fibre to their own infrastructure?
See, with fibre, what happens is they use the exchange, the telephone exchange itself. So the telephone exchange will be the same. However, what they tend to do is put some kind of splitting device from the exchange, and then from that device they start running their own cable. However, they use existing ducting of Openreach.
Okay, that's good, because what you are now saying is that the ducting and the existing infrastructure in place which allows service providers to lay their fibres is Openreach's.
Depending if it's there. Meaning, say there's an area where Openreach hasn't gone to, and Community Fibre would go to that area, then they would have to lay their own, provided there is.
That's perfectly understandable. The last leg you are talking about.
Yeah.
But up to a point where Openreach is present and their infrastructure is present, their ducting is present, these service providers are going to use those infrastructures. They are not going to dig our roads and pavements in order to create their own networks. That's what I'm trying to get at.
No, providing the ducting's there and they don't have any, issues with using it, they'll use it.
You mentioned, may I continue?
Last one,
Mr.
and
Chairman?
then we'll move to Councillor Bliss.
You mentioned that Community Fibre are going to lay down fibre optics, free fibre optic connection. Is this free to use, or is this free just to deliver fibre optic into our premises?
Community Fibre have agreed to lay free connectivity, meaning free to use fibre for 10 community buildings. So to use.
meaning that we do not pay them
Correct.
a penny for rental, etc., etc.
Correct.
That's really good. What's the benefit to them?
The benefit is they're community fibre, so they deliver a social value for digital inclusion to the residents, hence their name Community Fibre.
Thank you. Councillor Bliss?
Yeah, I've got a couple of points. I mean, if you go to page 35, number 2, the community fibre bit, I think that needs a word changed at the end of the first line. It should read maybe full fibre, the borough's social housing and the addition of 10, rather than with the addition of 10.
Okay.
But my question on that is, when you're talking about social housing, are you talking about individual houses owned by the council or estates or both?
It's both. Yeah, it's both. So they're currently surveying. I mean, they're servicing flats and shared unitship, but the fibre they've been running around across Hayes and Uxbridge is to individual households as well. So it's everywhere. That residents where it might have been stuck with old dishes on the thing or old phone lines will have access to the fast fibre now. And that's that stat we've got to get up from 5% to, overtake our neighbouring boroughs and beyond. We've got to get much better coverage so people can get the fibre, because you just know how quick it is once you've got that compared to old technology.
Yeah, just to point out, social housing is one of the aspects where they will be connecting the fibre. However, as you would imagine, when you're having a road, wherever the trailing cables are going, they'll easily be connected to individual units of private housing, private businesses and whomever.
Councillor Bliss, did you have further?
Yeah, it was just on page 48, it says, develop a levelling up programme to improve digital connectivity standards and bring greater investment into the north of the borough. And I wondered if you could explain why you think the north needs more investment?
Yes, so as we saw on Connect London, we can see there is low connectivity in the upper regions of the north. So we're trying to focus to try uplifting that so there's larger connectivity and to close the gap of the coverage where there are black spots in the north of the borough.
I think some of that just comes from, it's so spread out over there and lots of green, and it's quite costly for providers to go in, run along cables, and there's not a lot of chimney pots who people are going to sign up to the businesses. So, and some of the work with BT is saying it's very nice, but you've got to now go and do some more work for us in the north of the borough, and that's the second piece of work we're doing with them.
So this is north of the borough, as in the north, as in probably northward Harefield, as opposed to north of the A40. Okay. Councillor Edgington?
Yes, it was really just, I'm not sure I understood why we are so far behind. Do we know why? We know we are, and we know we've got to get better, but what of the other boroughs? Maybe it's just been more compact, but why is our percentage so much less on so many of these measures?
See, I think when we spoke to the providers, they said when they tried approaching the borough, unfortunately, there were a lot of, no communication, no channels open for communication. So I'm not sure how that was. And also with, say, 5G masts and stuff like that, a lot of mast applications were getting rejected for the basis of sight and appearance. So that is one thing that we have alleviated by putting us on the counselling committee.
Yeah, I think one of the benefits of us having a digital strategy is that it does show to the market that we're in for the business. We've turned around agreements in record time, hence that we've now got the BT here investing their money because we're easy to play with, and it's worked quite well. So I think it's about us just being fit and ready to engage with the market with focus officers who people can contact and get an instant response, and it's paying dividends, and hopefully we carry on.
Councillor Tubadar?
Well, I think it's excellent and well done, everybody involved. We need uplift. We are the first borough which is going to lay fibre optic across all 7 exchanges. So excellent work. Thank you very much, everybody. The only thing which I would like to, if possible, to see a plan which indicates the extent of work community fibre is going to do and what does it entail. Because it is not, logically, it doesn't make sense to have open reach, having fibre infrastructure across the borough which other service providers could actually use to provide a service, and then having other service providers building networks, because that is just going to cause havoc in our roads and pavements. And street furniture, once they put them in there, they don't look after them. My experience tells me the less infrastructure is put in place, or perhaps if we just have one service provider who provided the underlay infrastructure, it will be a better place to go to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for Councillor Graham. Sorry, one question.
Yes, Chairman. Just leading on from Councillor Tubidar's point, obviously digital connectivity is a very expensive exercise. Who are the overall contributors to making this go forward? That's what I would like to know.
We have OpenReach, who are the major contributor of our borough. We have Community Fibre and Hyper Optic.
And all of those parties, they obviously lobby government for funding, and hence, OpenReach are investing heavily now. I'm sure government are backing that. And people like Community Fibre, they'll also be applying for grants and other things, and not giving them a monopoly to maybe just OpenReach might be beneficial for us in the long run, that we can get other people who access different grants. What we are doing with people like OpenReach and Community Fibre is sharing with them things like our road programme, because we don't want to go down and do a nice new paved way and then find out a week later they want to turn up and put a fibre down. So us working closely with them will stop some of that, and traffic management and other things.
Councillor Tubadar, final one, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Precisely, this is what I was trying to highlight, that having one service provider which provides the underlay is much beneficial to us as a borough. And therefore, if you could supply us with some information on what the extent of work which Community Fibre is going to get involved with, it will be very beneficial from our point of view to have some view of what is happening in our borough with regard to this development. And I welcome and congratulate you all on the work which you are doing with OpenReach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much both for your time this evening. Welcome to leave when you... Okay. Thank you. It brings us to agenda item 8, which, Ian, if you're able to join us, thank you. We can change the name places around as well. No, it's not that one. There we go. Lovely. So thank you, Ian. Thank you for joining us. I know you're a regular at the committee meetings with the complaints and service monitoring report. So here we have one for April 2020 to 31st of March 2021. Grateful if you'd like to talk through and highlight anything, and then I'm sure we'll probably have a few questions for you from members. Please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Councillor. Yes, I do appear every year. So, last year, when I was presenting before the POC, I was asked to provide longer-term information, so over a longer period of time. You also want to know all the information in relation to Ombudsman investigations, so you want to know all the various decisions that are made. So what I've done today is I've provided you with a high-level analysis of the complaints, compliments, and also members' inquiries across the council. And I'll just talk you through really the areas that it impacts on this committee, but what the report provides you with information across the whole council. And I'm happy to deal with any questions that you have. In terms of overall, COVID has had an undoubted impact on the performance of the number of complaints and inquiries that we've received. For example, overall, we've received a higher number of informal complaints. I think people at home generally have had more time to submit inquiries and complaints, and they've done that, so that's seen that increase. We've had fewer formal complaints, which is interesting. So, for example, we had informal complaints of 2,587, but only 789 formal stage 1 complaints, which, if you extrapolate that, you will actually find that of the total number of informal complaints, something like 70% are being resolved in an informal way, and it reduces the number to 789. The complaint process then goes into stage 2, and again, the impact of that is significant. You've gone from 789 complaints, formal complaints, and down all the way to 42. So the process is doing what it's designed to do. It's dealing with the complaints, it's trying to resolve it. And what I would say to you is that the focus of the council, Perry and his teams and people around here, is very much on resolution. So if there's a problem, what do we do to sort it out? And that's what the focus has always been, really. But what has been surprising is that the number of compliments, 502 in total, which is a significant improvement from years to come. I know we'll be talking about repairs in a minute, but repairs is one of the highest areas where we receive compliments, which is really significant. But Perry won't like me to say this, but the area that has the significant number of compliments is actually called wildflowers. We've had more compliments for wildflowers than almost anything across the council. And people, I think in this time where it's not ideal world at the moment, to see some lovely little wildflowers growing has created sort of significant happiness from some people. In terms of members' inquiries, we've had fewer members' inquiries this year than the 2 years before that. I don't think that's surprising, bearing in mind the COVID and the restrictions in place. I've also provided you with a lot of data in terms of members' inquiries by ward. One of the things I need to mention to you, which has come to light fairly recently, is that you will notice that Uxbridge South as a whole has a massive number of members' inquiries. What I've discovered in doing that is that when a member's inquiry is recorded, if a member's inquiry doesn't include a location address, it automatically defaults it to the Civic Centre. And because the Civic Centre is part of Uxbridge South, you've ended up with a massive figure. So I need to do some work with our IT colleagues to see how that can be corrected. So, for example, if an elected member provides information that they may ask, say, can you tell me how many volumes of library books there are, or whatever, which doesn't involve a location, it automatically defaults that to Uxbridge South. So I need to find a way of doing it slightly differently, which will then reflect the actual inquiry that we have. One of the discussion points, I suppose, is a question as to what is a member's inquiry. At the moment, what happens is, if an elected member submits an inquiry, we treat it as a member's inquiry. So it could be there's a pile of rubbish on Uxbridge High Street. We treat that as a member's inquiry. But to me, that would be more like a request for a service rather than a member's inquiry. So it's something that a discussion that needs to be had to determine what we need to do going forward. But that's perhaps not for this meeting at this point. In terms of the actual areas that this committee covers, I'll deal with Appendix C, which is the number of housing complaints, and Appendix G, which is the Finance Directorate, which is the number of complaints that are received there. So just going through housing complaints as a whole, we've had 24% more informal complaints, so it's gone up from 457 for the year before to 568 for this year. 31% more formal stage 1 complaints, so it's gone up from 177 to 231. Of the complaints, whether it's informal or formal, the bulk of the complaints tends to be in the area of people saying, why can't you do my work quicker? It's about that timeline. It's also about the council being able to find the resources to actually, when I say resources, not staffing resources, actually equipment, material to get the work done, which sometimes it has been difficult to source because other organisations will also be shut down for whatever reason, mainly because of COVID. Staff have also been isolating, so it's harder to do things and it takes a bit more time. So there have been a plethora of questions that we've had to deal with, which have been different to previous years. But no doubt people want the work that needs to be done quicker and as quickly as they possibly can. When it comes to stage 2 complaints, which is the formal stuff, that has gone down from 31 to 21, and the number of investigations undertaken by the Ombudsman has also gone down significantly. What the Ombudsman did last year was, for a period of about 4 to 5 months, they stopped investigating complaints, and it was just a fallow period where they allowed the council to focus on other areas, mainly in dealing with COVID. And so there was a big chunk of time where they didn't actually undertake any investigations. Personally, I think we would have preferred to have actually for them to carry on, because what happened is there was a bottleneck, and eventually you end up with it, because the council as a whole was best placed to deal with it anyway. The number of compliments has gone up for housing from 92 to 132. So when you compare the total number of formal stage 1 complaints, which is 231 for last year, you also had 132 compliments. You know, it's a pretty significant number of compliments there, where people have taken the time to say, well done, you've done a good job there. In terms of the Finance Directorate, this is probably the high-performing directorate in terms of responding to complaints. We had 48% more informal complaints, but in terms of numbers, they're quite low, so it's gone up from 82 to 121. When it comes to formal stage 1 complaints, that's gone down from 213 to 171, which was expected. Fewer stage 2 complaints as well, which has gone down from 21 to 15, and fewer Ombudsman investigations. But the number of compliments has gone up from 10 to 17, which is not in anything to compare with housing, but it's still a significant number of compliments that have been received. I think that's probably all I wanted to say to you at this point, but I'm happy to take any questions on any areas that you've got.
Thank you. Open up to members for any questions. Councillor Tubadar.
We do, for members' inquiries, we do have a system, a database, some form of registration program.
All members' inquiries, Councillor, are recorded in a system called Onyx. So what happens is, as soon as you make a telephone call or you send an email or whatever form it comes in, that inquiry is then recorded on Onyx. And then what happens is the information that's provided here comes from Onyx in terms of the data there.
Excellent. Is there such a thing as a self-service in this system, so that we could use to speed up the member inquiry request? Because I often find that it takes, especially in waste area, okay, we all know waste collection, removal of waste, etc., but it takes about 2 or 3 days sometimes, depending on the workload the staff have, for that to get processed and be passed to the department which is dealing with the issue itself. Now, something as simple as waste, which we could all recognize, we could probably shorten the time. I mean, it takes me a while to write an email. I probably could upload photos and the location and the nature of the problem faster if the self-service was available to me. It has 2 benefits. One, it will shorten the time which the rubbish is picked up.
Councillor, if I may, I think this report is more around the complaints monitoring rather than the process of reporting and actioning.
Thank you for that.
Is that all right?
Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you.
Right.
I can actually help with that, Councillor. What's happening is that the members' inquiries process is we're actually looking, and I think Perry's in the lead in that, moving it towards a different platform called GOS, and I think that platform will be far more receptive, and it will, I believe, give you what you're looking for in terms of the self-service element of it. which you're right, actually, it probably takes you a few seconds to click it and then it goes automatically to the person. So I know Waste Services is already trialling something of a similar nature, and we are trying to give members the option of self-service, but there may be some who may not prefer to do that, to give the people the option of both. But it has the potential to save staff time as well. So we are moving in that direction, actually, and quite a lot of work's already been done in terms of that. So GOS is something that we're working towards in terms of trying to achieve what you're suggesting.
Excellent, thank you. The other thing which I was going to ask, obviously you've managed to explain, is the number of members' inquiries in Oxbury South, because I was puzzled. I was looking at the report, calculating and recalculating, number crunching, and I couldn't reach those numbers.
You knew you'd been busy, but not that busy, right?
Absolutely.
Lovely.
So thank you for clarifying that point as well.
Councillor Harangi.
Quick question from me. There's a lot of data, very comprehensive. Quick question, do you do any text analytics on the data, as in, I mean, there's a lot to do with numbers here, but any qualitative analysis on complaints?
It's done in what Naveed was here earlier, and I'm part of his directorate. So in the future, that's what we will start to do, but we don't do as much of that as we should do, I think. The difficulty is that when you look across the piece and you provide, there's a sheer volume of, and you're trying to then extrapolate what does that actually mean for the council, and that's quite hard to do, because even though numbers might appear to be high in terms of volumes of complaints, but percentage-wise they're actually quite low in terms of the services that we provide. So you're trying to extrapolate this small bit of information and say, well, actually, Perry, you need to go and sort this out based on small data. But we will be doing more of that, Councillor. You're absolutely right.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Ian, thank you for coming this evening and presenting that to us. Thank you. Okay, agenda item 9 is the Cabinet Forward Plan. Anyone any questions, comments on this? Councillor Edgington?
Yes, I wonder whether at some stage before the Cabinet meeting in November we could see or consider the financial assistance to voluntary sector, which I think is November. No page numbers, but somewhere there. Voluntary sector. It's not page numbered. So.
That in the
oh yes, sorry, page 103.
December.
So I was not looking sideways, actually.
Page 103 or 104? Page 104?
103. 103. It says voluntary sector report. Oh, sorry, no.
That's voluntary sector leaflet.
Sorry, it is 104. The
financial assistance, Hillingdon's local voluntary assistance.
That's it.
The report's Cabinet will make recommendations on the level of financial support to voluntary organisations 2022-23 financial year.
That's it.
What would you like?
If we could have a look at it and see what the
proposals are.
Yeah, and make some suggestions.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, we'll see what we can get, but it probably won't be it may not be the exact report that goes to Cabinet, because it may not be ready at that time. But we can see what we can get in advance of that.
Well, it's December, so perhaps we could have it in the. Have we got a meeting in November sometime?
I'm going to say yes, we do, in some time.
Don't know when.
Yes, we do. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. With that, everyone happy to note that? Thank you. Agenda item 10 is the work programme. So next meeting, 21st of October. Within that, we have the second witness session for our review. And I think, as we mentioned earlier, the James Wigley, I think, is probably not required, having learnt more about his specific role tonight. That he was on a few selected parts within that, so I think we will look to change to make those witnesses as beneficial as we can in that. Given the number of witnesses we have, I think that's probably going to be a relatively lengthy session. We don't have too many other items that evening. What we do have is repairs and maintenance, and again, going to speak to officers in advance of that. Intention is that that's going to be on repairs and maintenance, mostly around housing. I think that's what members were hoping that was going to be around. If anything different, do say. No? Okay, good. So that's what we will work towards on that. With that, we're happy to note that work programme for the coming sessions. Thank you. That brings us to the end of part 1, so we will cut the online feed. Thank you to everyone online who has joined us this evening.